Bar width is personal, but I feel a lot of mountain bikers have got this key dimension wrong. But bar width, when you find the right one for you, is amazing and it can transform your riding. And as upgrades go, it's one of the most cost effective. So let's explore bar width. Bar width is a really simple upgrade and it makes a huge difference to how you ride. Bars have got lots of different factors as to why a certain width is going to suit you for where you're riding, and we're going to explain all of those. But a very brief history, because we've got more on that later, is that bars used to be really narrow, and then over time they've gotten wider and wider and wider. So now your new bike or your aftermarket bar could very realistically be too wide for you, and we're going to explain why. Handlebars come in lots of different shapes and sizes. Ooh. And I'm not even talking about those almost road bike weird ones. No, we are talking about proper mountain bike ones here. And the first dimension we need to look at is bar width. I measure bar width from the edge of the grip to the edge of the grip. And that means that it is subtly different from the actual bar width, because often the grips have a little bit extra on the ends. But there's some other dimensions on the handlebar that we need to look at to understand what's going on. And the first one is rise. Now, this one in itself might be a little bit confusing, but it's literally from the center of the bar where it's clamped into the stem up to that first bit. That's our first measurement. So after we've got this rise, the next dimension is upsweep. So as the name suggests, it's a sort of arc from that center clamp upwards. And this is where I talked about rise before, and that's just in one sort of direction and one dimension. But where your handlebars and where your grips end up at the very outer edges might be different because of this upsweep dimension. The next dimension is back sweep. So from the center clamp, this is an arc rearward. You can get lots of different variations of back sweep, and the key thing is that some of these dimensions are baked into the bar: the rise, the upsweep, the rearward sweep. But where you clamp them and how you can roll the bar back in the stem can change lots of these dimensions together. Again, we're just going to talk about bar width in this one, but there are a whole gamut of different dimensions with a handlebar. So, back to the new cult in mountain biking that wider is better, but perhaps that isn't actually true. We're going to experiment with a range of different bars to find out what works for me and explain how I have to adapt my riding for the different bars. We're going to start with a 800mm width bar, which is actually pretty stock on a lot of mountain bikes these days. We're then going to cut them down to a really narrow, around 680, 670. And then we're going to try and use my optimized size. I say optimized, it's the one that I've taken years and years to get to, which is around 745, 750. And just see how differently they ride, how I've got to adapt my riding, and how they affect where I can ride. 800mm is really wide, and 670, well, it's not going to give me the leverage or control I think I'm used to. Let's experiment. So how have we got to a point where our bars are too wide? Well, mountain bikes originally, like the early clunkers, actually had pretty wide bars, because lots of those clunkers, those pre-mountain bikes that they're using in Marin Hills, well, they had motorbike bars. They were 680 or almost 700. Then during the 90s, there was a real cross-country boom and everything got very narrow and tight. And for reasons why, well, we're not really sure. Some of it is that racing is really shoulder to shoulder in cross-country. Some of it is that, well, there were lots of roadies migrating because mountain biking was booming. And then there was this lightweight cult. And bars really reduced down. They reduced down and down and down until they got, well, some races were running sort of 550-ish bar width, which now seems exceptionally narrow. And here's a little example. This one's got built-in bar ends. And that's another thing that happened. With the bars that got so narrow, there's so little leverage to be had here that we had to have, well, a different position for climbing, yes, different hand position as well. But it's also an extra position to get more leverage on the bike, a little bit more control for climbing and wrenching the bike around. Because of this cross-country trend, lots of production bikes started to get fitted with these really narrow and, well, flat bars. And it was riders like Hans Ray and lots of downhill riders that then started to take influence on the sport. And, well, for the better, we got wider bars and we got higher rises. And we got different shapes that were more comfortable. And I say bars got wider, we probably got to a point where production bars were around 680, which is still considered now quite narrow. But then something happened on the downhill scene. We had some really big characters in the sport and also really big racers. People like Steve Peat, like Nathan Rennie, like Greg Minnaar, really big hulking guys who started to run really wide bars. And then the trend, well, it was pretty much set. These were really fast, exciting races to watch. And one of their keys to success was, well, wider bars. So everyone must have a wider bar, right? That's what makes you fast. Now, fast forward, we've got to a point where a lot of production bikes and a lot of aftermarket bars are, well, over 810 millimeters. That is really, really wide, not just in comparison to this, but in comparison to motorbikes. Motocross bikes are coming with a similar width bar. It's very interesting. But back to bars. There's a heck of a lot going on with a handlebar and how it influences your ride. But in effect, we've got two core things that we need to look out for when we're looking for the right bar, and that's control and that's ergonomics. Where you ride, how you ride, and what style of riding you're doing are all going to impact where you fit on this balance between total control and total ergonomic fitment. And it is those sort of two extremes. So if you're kind of a going far, long distance cross-country racer, then the ergonomics are going to be the focus point. You're still going to need to control the bike, of course, but you can lean into the ergonomics and how much the bike will fit you to the best, because you need to optimize your physical performance, and that's how you can do it with ergonomics. If we go to the other side and you're all about control, let's say you're going to bike parks and you're really focusing on gravity riding, then we can almost swing that balance all the way over to control. Of course, we still need to pedal our bikes, and for this example here, we've got a trail bike, which is probably the perfect example of where we've got to balance the ergonomic limitations or constraints and how much control we want to get. It's all about balance. Ergonomics. It's a fun topic, and it's one that, well, you can fall into a real rabbit hole into. So how does it apply and how can we encapsulate it in a really short way? Very briefly, we're all quite different because the way our skeleton is formed and that bony bits and how long those bones are and how the joints are made, plus how all of the muscle, the tendon, the ligament are all knitted onto that bony structure, it's all going to be different from individual to individual. And that means that how strong we are, the range of motion that we have, is all going to be quite different. A great example of how we're ergonomically different is if we get into a press-up stance, because that shows that it's not just about how wide our shoulders are, it's also about what strength we've got. And as an example, if we're too narrow, we can be wobbly. If we're too wide, it's also just hard to get any movement back up because we haven't got the strength. And then you find that sweet spot. It's just right. Let me try and demonstrate. Here, I'm kind of unstable and it's really hard. I'm having to use my core a lot to be really stable. So about here feels pretty good. I've got pretty good range of motion. But if I go really wide, well, I just can't really move because I don't have the strength of my arms or my core. It is subtle, but I can't hold this much longer. All of our contact points on our bike, the pedals, the saddle, and the bars, effectively the grips, all change how we control the bike. But the bar has got the biggest influence on all of those. Why? Well, it's the bit that we're doing the steering with. And I know it sounds a bit basic, but it's quite a lot more about steering a bike than steering a car. And that's because we can lean the bike over, and that means that the contact patch, that's how we initiate that movement and change of direction, is coming from us moving the bar, changing the grip, and moving the balance point of the whole bike. When you look at the physics, it is actually really complicated. But it also means that how we control the bike and how we're able to move our weight around on the bar, and why those really narrow bars, well, we could struggle to get the leverage and we'd struggle to move around the bike enough. Whereas if we look at really, really wide bars, well, if we're too wide and we're too stretched out, we don't have the range of motion to move around the bike. And that's really important, especially with control, because we need to balance which wheel and which tyre has got the grip and got the load to make the turn, make the climb, and make rolling around and doing nice turns easy and controllable. We've had a wheel size change, and yes, that's meant that the wheel is bigger, but it's not bigger like a truck wheel is to a car wheel. So that's not why we need the extra leverage to help initiate the turns with a bigger wheeled bike. No, we've got a gyroscopic effect with the wheel, and the bigger wheel and the bigger mass means that it's got a bit more, well, momentum of inertia. It's got more gyroscopic effect, so it's harder to actually turn in. That means that we probably do need a little bit more leverage on a bigger wheel. Now, the final factor in this puzzle of control is geometry, and geometry has changed radically. Those mid-90s bikes with those really narrow bars had really steep head angles, and it meant they were very nervous and twitchy. And some of that was a necessary thing because the bars were so small that you kind of almost needed to have that to be able to control the bike. Bikes have gotten a huge amount slacker, and that has meant that how we control the front wheel, especially in the load and the wheel flop, means that having a wider bar, to a degree, actually helps those slacker bikes. As I've said, it is complicated and it is nuanced because there's lots of different factors, but handlebar is key for us to control our bike. Okay, here are the full-length uncut bars, and just for clarification, the bars that I'm using for all three different runs are all the same rise, all the same back sweep, all the same up sweep. Essentially it's the same bar and we're trimming it down to the right size. And that means that I'm not changing any of the other parameters, and it should mean that where my hands are just going to be further out. Okay, they're going to be slightly higher, as the up sweep of the bar kind of means that the very edge of the bars is slightly higher on a wider bar than it is on a very narrow bar. But just immediately the extra width is noticeable. It kind of just even sat here, it kind of like I can feel sort of my wrist angle, opposed to being able sort of inside and being over the front of the bike. I guess I'm having to pull myself to get that position, and as I'm then doing that, I can actually feel my back's not that flexible. I don't do the Pilates and yoga that I probably should do at my age. I'm having to rotate my pelvis to get into that position, and that is probably helping bring my body weight lower. So we'll see if that makes a difference on the trail to help weight the front wheel. I can notice it, well, in between my legs I can feel the difference, and that's because when you roll your pelvis you end up sitting on a different part of your sit bones, and if that's comfortable or not, well, yeah, the saddle will decide that one, but I can notice that difference. I guess the other thing is, it does feel like, I'm having to change my body position, so that is going to change, well, the dynamics of the bike as well. Oh, okay, interesting. I'm just about ready to go ride and feel them, and already my kind of outside arm away from the frame, I can't, in my normal kind of back position, I can't keep my hand on. The outside edge is pulling off, so I guess flags that the 800mm bar is wider, but it also means that my hand on the outside is having to turn such a bigger circle that I can't keep it on. Okay, this is a more extreme sort of steering angle, but it's not unrealistic on a tight and twisty trail. And I haven't even talked about getting through the trees yet, which, well, I've got a lot more bar to try and wiggle through. Okay, here we are. Ooh, okay, interesting. I can feel the width already. Oh, shivers. Right, I've got to lean forward a lot more. Oh, shivers. Wow, right, okay. That wasn't a traumatisation, but just getting around the corner, just the extra width. I guess I've got uncomfortable on the bar width that I ride. But my outside hand, so the one that's kind of moving away from me as I'm arcing round a turn, so I guess it's your left for a right-hand turn and vice versa, was starting to come off the bar, so hence missing the line. Let's try and get the rest of it without disasters. Okay, there's a lot of stability, so that's nice in the rough, but I'm struggling to actually turn. Okay, that was really fascinating. Just a very few turns already. Just the first turn, it's quite second turn, I guess, is quite noticeable. We're going to do a couple more runs because it is all about adaptation, seeing how I need to change my body position. I can definitely notice I'm having to sit differently on the climb, which I've got to say is not something I thought of. I'm taking my hands off the bars and sort of wanting to run them inside, because if I run them on the very extreme, my arm won't go there. Again, it's about adaptation, so my body could get used to it, but in those first few turns, the extra bar width was really challenging. Let's try again. Here we go. I've definitely got to pull forwards. Feels like I'm very low over the front. Okay, there is much more stability. But yeah, interesting. Where I thought I would not notice the bars is actually over the drops. It's not dissimilar as if you've got your saddle a bit too high and you're trying to drop your heels, maybe more so when you're clipped in. But yeah, you're unable to get the kind of movement, the suspension travel in your legs. The extra stability was nice, but it was almost like a steering damper in the fact that the bike didn't want to turn. So again, my pop conclusion is that because my arms are now very far apart, I don't have enough, well, I don't have enough movement in my arms to actually drop into the drop-away section of trail. Time for the narrow option. Right, we're going to take 60mm off these 800mm bars to get them really narrow. Anyway, I should do the warning, because you always need a warning on things whenever you're approaching them with tools, and that's that lots of bars have actually got a minimum width. You might wonder why. Well, it's because the way the tubing is made and how it's constructed to get a really nice smooth ride means that, well, it's going to be thicker further along, and it means it's not going to have the damping properties that you actually want if you cut it down too far. So do check before you chop. What have I done? In terms of width, they feel like a bar that I'd have on my townie or my sort of pizza bike to get around town. I'm, yeah, going to be interesting. Okay, even out of the saddle, just accelerating, I can feel the difference on this trail bike. It's, woo! Okay. I'm really having to use my body to move the bike around. I can't just muscle it around. I've got, whoa! Interesting. With this bar immediately, I was like, shivers. It is so very narrow. But I've kind of been able to adapt my riding style. I do feel, though, that the narrow bar, I'm struggling to get the leverage in this more technical terrain. Yeah, sprinting, I've got to use a lot more sort of body movement. And, I've got to be much more, yeah, my hands are already taking a pounding. Well, these are the 745 bar width, but then they're 750 with the grips on the outside. And it's taken me years to find the right ones for me. And that's because I guess I was a bit timid on experimentation. I was a bit scared of, well, trying the really wide bars, because I'd tried 760s when they came out quite a while ago and I didn't really get on with them. And then I started working as a race mechanic for some really, really fast downhill races. And then I realised that, well, they're really, really quick and they're not riding 760s. They're sort of, at the time, they were under that. They were 740, 750. Maybe over time they've increased their bar width. But for me, even though this bar in particular is a slightly higher rise than I've ridden before, the stem is slightly longer, so it feels like it balances it out. It is really personal, but I think the big thing is that 50mm off your stock bar, nibbling in, does make a real difference. And it makes a difference in lots of bits of the terrain that I'm riding, because I really like the twisty, single tracky stuff. And I'm also not super wide. So there's lots of factors as to why this bar works for me. Narrow versus wide. The narrow, well, the extreme narrow that we did, well, it felt like my shoulders were a little bit pinched in and I didn't have the leverage, I didn't have the extra control that I really wanted. For cross country, maybe that balance would be okay, but it did feel a little bit pinched. Now, we've got to remember though that what we were kind of calling narrow used to be actually the wider size. So racers used to run even narrower back in the day. Now, to the wide, or the new wide as we should call it, these widths of over 800. I've seen bars listed at 850, and that's a really wide, big bar. And it's interesting because when you look at motocross bikes, well, those have got bars of a similar width. Now you might think, okay, well, when I'm really shredding the gnar, I'm almost doing like a motocrosser does. And to a degree, I can understand why you might think that, but we are on push bikes, and okay, some of the speeds that some people can go will almost be as fast as MX bikes, but how we're positioned on the bike is quite different. On an MX bike, we can pull forward, and, well, yeah, we can get our range of motion, because that was something that I found on the really wide bar. I've got relatively long arms for my height, but I just couldn't get my arms around in that position. The other problem I had with the really wide bar was that when I was in the position, it did give me lots of stability, but the width limited my range of motion. It is a really fine balance because we're not talking about a huge difference from our narrow bar to our really mega wide bar. And there is a little sweet spot, but it's worth trying to find it because it can make a really good difference. Yes, bar width is personal, and I found my sweet spot through trial and error. And for me, for cross-country trail bikes, it's between 725 up to 750. So it is a relatively narrow range, but it is a lot slimmer and a lot narrower than a lot of stock bars. But that's just me. You could be different. I reached out to some of my friends to find out, well, what bars they're running. So I say friends, some of them are pretty quick on a bike. And first up, I'm gonna look at my phone because we've got lots of details and numbers to get through. So first we've got Jen Jackson, Canadian national champion, cross-country racer, very quick, currently top 10. She's running a 720, but she's spoken about how previously she ran a 700 bar, but she's happy with the extra width. Kenta Gallagher, so he's Cannondale Factory Team's XC technical coach, and he's also a former World Cup XC and downhill racer. He's on 760 on his trail bike, but then on his EMTB, he's up to 780. Next, we've got Michaela Parton. She's a Scottish downhill slayer, trail bike, 750, and 760 on a DH bike. So it feels like it's not just me that's tailoring what bar width they're running for what terrain they're tackling. Yolanda Neff, 700 millimeters, sometimes up to 720. Charlie Aldridge, Vice European XC champion, and, well, all-round slayer and good guy, 740. So the trend that we had seen where cross-country was really narrow and downhill was really wide, well, that's changing. Then we've got Joe Smith. So he's an ex-World Cup racer. I know him really well because I worked with him for about 2 or 3 years. He's a coach now at Dovey Bike Park, and he is a real trail slayer. He even rode Hardline this year. He's on 760. So there's someone who's hitting really big lines, and he's on, well, a bar that's not far off the same width as mine. Okay, then we've got some other people. So we've got Braga Vestervig. Yes, the absolute free ride slayer. He's going to be on a massive bar, isn't he? He's only on 780. So just think about this. He's one of the gnarliest free riders that we've seen in a generation, dropping some of the biggest drops I've got to say I've ever seen. And he's a really nice guy. And he's a Viking. And he's running a bar that's narrower than you'll find on lots of stock bikes. It's interesting. Hopefully you found that little nugget about all those different dimensions useful. I did, because I thought it was really fascinating that we've got this incredible spectrum of racers, from cross-country World Cup races to downhill to free ride gnarly dudes. And all of their bar width is within a pretty tight window of give or take 40 mil each side. But all of them are running bars that are narrower than you'll get stock on lots and lots of bikes. And I think that flags something, that if you've got a new bike or you've upgraded your bars and you're looking at optimizing your fit, it's really worth having a play around with bar width. So trying to run your grips inside a little bit. Obviously, make sure you've got bar plugs in there, but just to see what 10 mil narrower will feel like. Because if Braga Vestervig is running a 780 and you're running 810 plus, maybe it's time to just re-look at your bar position and your ergonomics on your bike, not just for your bike fit, but better control as well. Okay, that's enough waffle. What bar width are you running? Let me know down in the comments below.